Hello, and welcome to the Let's Do a Crime podcast. I'm Ryan, he, him.
And I'm Mouse, they, them.
I've worked in emergency services for over 10 years, including law enforcement, but not as a police officer.
And I'm an artist. I work predominantly in ink and watercolor mediums, and I physically cannot tell the difference between vehicles.
I can attest to that. I've had a Subaru Outback wagon and a Toyota 4Runner sitting next to each other that one mouse could see over, one mouse could not see over, and they could not tell which one was which.
They just look the same to me. I know that they're not, but they are. You know what I mean?
The only reason why they can tell my cars apart right now is because one of them is white and purple. That's the only reason.
I mean, yeah. Even though logically I know they're very different.
Even though one's a sports car and the other one's an SUV.
Well, they look the same. Okay, anyway, what are we talking about today, Ryan?
Well, what do you know about undercover operations?
I know that people sometimes do like deep undercover where they put on like entire personalities and like for years they'll be working in like gangs and stuff. And I also know about a technique that we use in Canada that's like really controversial.
Which is what we're talking about today. We're talking about Mr. Big.
Oh, my favorite.
Wikipedia says that sometimes it's called the Canadian technique. I have never heard it called that.
I've only ever heard Mr. Big.
But that might be because I'm in Canada.
Yeah.
So first I'm going to explain a couple basic legal concepts.
Mm-hmm.
So like entrapment. This is one thing that like people don't really understand. So entrapment is when the police in some way coerce you or make you like force you to do a crime that you would not normally have done.
Right.
But if they're helping you do a crime or giving you the resources to do a crime that you already want to do, that's not entrapment. So like if you're going, I want to blow up this building, but I don't know how, and then me, undercover officer, is like, I know a guy, here's some dynamite. Not entrapment. You might not agree with that, but that's not entrapment.
Oh, but if you were the one who was like, hey, you know what I think would be a really good idea? If you blew up this building and here's some dynamite.
Yeah, that would be entrapment because you were not likely to have done that crime without me spurring you to do it. Whereas the argument is that the other way of me just helping, you could have easily found some other way to do it and probably would have.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of different. That's a really, really basic rundown version, but like if their cops are involved in a crime you're doing anyway, it's not entrapment.
Power dynamic thing.
Yeah. So I'm going to give a trigger warning here.
Okay.
So while we're not going to talk about it specifically or in depth, this episode does contain murder and a suicide mention as well as child death.
Oh, nice.
We're not going into detail. We're only incidentally talking about them as we're mostly talking about the investigation tactic.
Mm-hmm.
But due to the nature of what this tactic is, it's mostly used in murder investigations.
Right.
So it's kind of hard to get around without talking about that.
Right. That's honestly very fair, and thank you for the warning.
Yeah. And so I'm going to start with another legal concept that doesn't directly have to do with this, but is important in how to think about what the police are doing in these situations.
Mm-hmm.
There's a case R.V. Hebert, 1990. Now, I mentioned in a previous episode, but in Canada, cases with the R as either the plaintiff or defendant, that is the Crown, aka the government.
Right.
R stands for Rex, which just means like the monarch.
The king, like the T-Rex.
So if the R is first, it means that the government is prosecuting. If the R is second, it means that like the government's being sued or something, right?
Okay.
So this is R.V. Hebert, so it's a case they're prosecuting.
Mm-hmm.
This 1990 case is a landmark Supreme Court decision in Canada. The Cliff Notes is that Neil Hebert was arrested for armed robbery, was given a standard charter caution, which is our version of what the states would call Miranda rights.
Oh, right, the right to remain silent.
Yeah. Ours is quite a bit different and pretty long-winded. Like we have like 5 steps you have to go through to like properly charter someone.
Mm-hmm.
But
you really need to make sure people know their rights.
Oh yeah, like it's got like ever since like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was put in place, which the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as we know it only came into effect in like 1987.
Oh my god,
it's fairly recent.
That's too recent, but
yeah.
Okay.
But as time goes on, like the standard charter cautions we've been using have been getting longer and longer. But it's for Americans or people familiar with American media, it's the same as Miranda rights. We just say different things.
If you've seen CSI or NCIS or any of that, the right to remain silent.
Yeah.
Just think of that as we're going.
Yeah, it's just phrased a bit differently.
Yeah.
As per normal, and he declined to make any statements. He was then put into a cell. An undercover officer was also put in the same cell, posing as another detainee, and through chit-chat, was able to get incriminating statements from Hebert. The court later ruled that these statements were not admissible as evidence, as once someone is in police custody, now that's important, in police custody, and has decided to exercise the right to silence, their right to silence can't be circumvented due to trickery from the police. So this person was in police custody, had been given his proper caution, had chosen not to make any statements, and the police tricked the statement out of him. So the court held that that's a violation of his rights.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that assessment.
So that legal concept is important. You can trick a confession out of someone, but not once they're in police custody and not once they're Mirandized or chartered in our case.
Yeah. And what's the difference between like being in custody and being in the interrogation room? Is that different or is that the same?
It depends. You could be in an interrogation room without being in custody. So if you're in custody, it means you've been arrested or otherwise detained and you can't leave. Okay. You can be called in to be interviewed by the police and be in an interrogation room. And this is not legal advice, and this is not going to apply everywhere. I don't know law everywhere. Yeah. But generally speaking, if you haven't been told you can't leave if you don't have a reason to think you're detained. So, for example, if you're pulled over at a traffic stop, you're detained. But if you're like invited to come in and speak to the police, you can just leave. Unless if you can't leave, they'll tell you. In which case, they're supposed to start this process of like charter cautioning you and all that. Okay. But
again, this is not legal advice. This may be different depending on the area in which you live in. So take this with just like with caution.
Yeah. So a lot of people say don't talk to the police. I'm not going to say to do that because there's lots of reasons to talk to the police. Yeah. But if you think that you are being suspected of a crime, you should be getting legal advice.
Oh yes, always ask for a lawyer.
Yeah, you should if you're talking to the police for a reason that you initiated, like you called for help or like you're legitimately a witness of something, like fine, whatever. But like if you're thinking that like this is seeming like you're maybe a suspect or that this doesn't feel right, just get legal advice. In Canada, we're actually required to provide access to free legal advice if you can't afford a lawyer. Most articles say that Mr. Big technique was pioneered in the 90s, but most cases I could find are 1999 or later. I went digging through laws. I was trying to find, because the articles kind of implied that this was pioneered in the early 90s, and it may have been, but I couldn't find any case from that time.
But it could be that the Mr. Big technique just wasn't big at the time.
Hey.
God, I'm sorry.
But in my digging, I did find a much earlier mention than 1999, and it's not what we think of Mr. Big today, but it's close, and it's kind of like the proto Mr. Big technique. Okay. This is the 1901 case, R.V. Todd.
Oh, that's way earlier.
So it tripped me out because I was reading about like the King's Court and stuff like that, which of course we have a King's Court again because the Queen just died, but like for my whole life it's been the Queen's Court, so like seeing the King's Court was a bit of a trip. So the Winnipeg police hired David Yadow and William McBean to try to get a confession from Donald Todd regarding the murder of a John Gordon. So they pretended to be members of a very profitable organized crime syndicate and offered to make Todd a member if he had done a serious enough crime to like roll with their crew. Right. And so him wanting to like make money confessed to this murder to them, and this was actually held in court. The court held that it found this tactic distasteful, but that the evidence was admissible as it did not violate any current rules. And it also noted that McBean and Yadow were not peace officers, like they were civilians that were hired to help this investigation. Okay. I don't know what legal significance it would have had at that time. In the modern day, it's kind of weird if you don't have peace officer status and you're doing these kind of investigations. Generally speaking, if you're hired by the government to do something in these investigations, you are a government agent and are held to pretty much the same rules as a peace officer, even if you're not one.
Okay, and this would be different from like an informant.
Yeah, an informant is usually a criminal who's been caught and is
Okay.
giving information as like a plea deal kind of thing.
Okay, so you can't just be like a regular average person and be an informant.
You can be like, you want an informant that's on the inside. Like sometimes you'll have like whistleblowers, like someone who is not a criminal but they're inside an organization like a company and has learned of something. They might go to the police and the police might want them to stay in that position so they can get them more information. It gets fuzzy there, but generally they wouldn't be considered an agent to the government because they're not actually working for the government. They're just helping with the investigation as a witness.
Okay.
But like, if I were to hire you, like to go to your school and find this information, you are now a government agent in the eyes of the court because, like, I'm paying you.
Okay.
Right. But of course, this was 1901. The laws are way different at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually don't know what legal significance they would have. That it seems like the court held the position that because they weren't peace officers, they weren't held to the same standards, even though they were being paid. So, which I find likely at the time. Like I said, the charter wasn't in place yet. There's most of the legal protections we take for granted weren't in place yet.
Well, also if you think about it, like Canada as a nation is still fairly new in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, and this would have been under the British Empire.
It's possible that at the time there were just issues that like they hadn't had to think about dealing with, especially with like a new colonized area.
Yeah. Well, and at the time, there was also stuff like, you would have, like, say, the RCMP, there would only be one RCMP working in an area. Mm-hmm. If he needed help, he would, like, deputize people and bring them with him. Mm-hmm. It's a legal concept that still exists, but is not used anymore.
Yeah.
Like, we still have it where, like, if I'm acting as like, a uniformed law enforcement member, like a peace officer, and someone's helping me and I'm directing them, then they have some protection legally because they're operating, like, I'm telling them to do something.
So they're like an extension of you.
Yeah, so they're still somewhat responsible for their actions, but like I'm more responsible in that case. Mm-hmm. At this time, you could full on just like be like, boys, bring your guns, we're gonna go get this guy, and it was this is where like a posse would come in. Like they would call this a posse, where they would just gather up like local men to go like arrest someone. Not a thing anymore. Probably a good thing.
Probably.
Yeah. Yeah. So court held that this was fine. And I can't find any more uses of it until we get into the 90s. Mm-hmm. I'm going to say that my first notable questionable use that I could find was regarding the murders of German tourist Andrea Schurp and Bernhard Gorki, or Goreik. I'm not sure exactly how it's pronounced. But they were found murdered in 1983. Suspect Andy Rose was convicted in 1991, based entirely almost on a witness testimony. The police learned of this witness via an informant that was in their drug dealing operation. Mm-hmm. So this comes back to like she's not a government agent because she wasn't like paid by the government. She was just a witness that came forward. Later they found that there's kind of some holes in her story, but like at the time this is pretty much the only evidence they really had on this guy.
Well, also like witness testimony is notoriously.
Yeah, witness testimony is the weakest form of evidence.
Yeah.
It is used in a lot of criminal convictions, and I will say witness testimony is very useful for a lot of things, but like I'm always a little bit dubious of a conviction based on only witness testimony. Witness testimony is ideally paired with a harder piece of evidence to contextualize that evidence.
Yeah, well, especially since like it's been proven time and time again that your memory is faulty. No matter how good you think it is, you're going to forget something. There's always going to be some key detail that just isn't there.
Also, people lie.
There's that too.
And I'm not saying this witness was a liar, but I am going to say that this witness tried to sell her story to the media for $30,000 later. So
she definitely at least tried to capitalize on it.
Yeah, there's definitely some fuckery there. Mm-hmm. DNA analysis ended up overturning the conviction in 1998, along with the statement from the ex-wife of another suspect, Vance Hill. So
wait, they arrested the wrong guy?
Yeah, basically, yeah. Hill had been arrested not too long after the murders in the same area of unrelated charges, lodging by false pretenses, which basically means like he lied to get housing somehow. I couldn't find any details on that, but that was the charge. He was American and went home for California. He committed suicide in July 1985, so the investigation into him kind of stopped there.
Right.
But before he died, he allegedly confessed the murders to his estranged wife, William Hill, who apparently she told her nephew, and the nephew told the cops. The story went that he gave those tourists a ride. He began sexually harassing Sherp, who was the woman, and then shot and killed them after an altercation. These allegations were never proven or even tested in court because he was already dead.
Right.
So where does Mr. Big come into this? Well, after Rose's conviction was overturned, police continued to attempt to get a new conviction on him. So they were still convinced that he was a guy.
Even though DNA had it exonerated him?
Well, the DNA, it didn't really exonerate him, it overturned the conviction. So basically, his DNA was not found on either of the victims, which doesn't mean he didn't do it, but it does bring the whole case into question.
Right.
And for anyone who's not aware, you don't win a case like this, as the defendant, by proving you didn't do it. Usually you can't prove you didn't do it. You win by proving that the government, the Crown, has not established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah, if there's basically any reasonable...
That's reasonable doubt. So, a reasonable person would look at that and be like, well, even if you're like, yeah, it looks like he did it, but, there's problems here. And so because this testimony wasn't the best, there was another conflicting testimony, and the DNA evidence didn't support the conviction. That's what overturned the conviction. So he wasn't exonerated. It's just that the conviction was ruled to be in error. And so they continued trying to get a conviction on him. Incidentally, I will note that that's the DNA evidence. There was no DNA evidence for Hill either, the guy who confessed. So,
okay.
But the way he told it, it seemed like he probably didn't even have to touch them. He shot them from his truck. So
right.
Like I said, the lack of DNA doesn't mean that either of them didn't do it. It just makes the case more flimsy. So after the conviction was overturned, the police tried to get a new conviction. They started hanging out in the same bars as Rose, pretending to be gang members. So apparently he was hanging around bars, kind of hanging out with gang member type people. So
yeah.
I'm not going to speculate on if he's a good person or not, but he was hanging out in these kind of circles.
He kept interesting company.
Yeah, so they were attempting to convince him to talk, and apparently while intoxicated, he did eventually confess. So...
I don't know. People confess to all kinds of shit when they're drunk.
Yeah, so the Crown ended up dropping the case. So this confession was never tested in court.
Yeah.
So dropping the case, that doesn't mean that they admitted he was right or whatever. Basically, the Crown basically decided that it wasn't worth pursuing. And I'm gonna guess it's probably because they thought that okay, this confession is kind of flimsy. We don't have a lot of hard evidence, so we should probably just walk away from this. So, and as far as I can tell, they haven't tried again. So that's the first questionable use you can find.
Did they ever find out what happened to those tourists?
No, it's still listed as an unsolved murder.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's really upsetting.
Yeah. So now we're gonna get into the RV Hart case.
Right.
Yeah, which is a pretty famous case about this being misused specifically. That there've been documentaries on it. This is kind of the big the Mr. Big has been used in Canadian court cases a lot. There's 320 or something convictions based on it.
Okay.
Australia uses it. New Zealand uses it. The United States doesn't use it. I wouldn't say it's banned, but just the way that their court rulings work, it's not easy to use it, so it's pretty much banned. The UK it also is similar. They won't allow it.
Right.
Germany will allow it, but only really specific strict conditions. So Canada kind of use it a lot, and this is the first case that came up that really brought the actions of the police into question when they were doing these kind of investigations.
Right.
So in August of 2002, 2-year-old twins Kristen and Karen had died of drowning.
Oh, I know this case.
Yeah, in 2005, Nelson Hart was charged with their murder. He claimed he had a seizure and Kristen fell off a wharf, and he could not swim, so he ran to get his wife, but left Karen behind. He claimed that she fell in the water after he left. For context, Hart was living on social assistance. He had a medical condition that did cause seizures. He only had grade 4 education, so his options are pretty limited. The police noted he was isolated, had very few friends, and pretty much only socialized with his wife. So that's kind of the picture of this man, right? In October of 2002, the Mr. Big operation began. Operatives made contact with him and gave him some low-level work, which is just doing some deliveries, and they became friends with him. This slowly escalated into staged crimes, so nothing violent, but like credit card fraud, forging documents. So as far as I can tell, there were no like actual victims of these crimes. These are all like set up crimes for him to do.
They were staging an escalation.
Yeah.
To see like what he would be willing to do.
Yeah, and he was led to believe that he was working with a large nationwide gang. Now I will note here that if they had tried to convict him for any of these crimes, that would be entrapment.
Right.
But they didn't ever pursue these, so they just didn't count.
Mm.
So meanwhile, they were also paying him extremely well. So he was doing all these little crimes. They were paying extremely well, and like he had friends which he hadn't met before. He was able to take trips and bring his wife on shopping sprees. So like they're living the high life now, which before like he was living on social assistance, right?
Right.
So in spring of 2003, he met with the boss. This is where the Mr. Big thing comes from. So
right, because you're meeting the big boss.
Yeah, you're meeting the boss of this alleged gang. Regarding joining the gang as a full member.
Mm-hmm.
They pressured him into regarding the drowning, and he confessed that he had pushed the girls into the water. This was recorded and used in court. I read somewhere that they also had him take them to the wharf and like reenact the crime, which is something that like a lot of investigators like. I'm not a detective. I don't do murder investigations, but I don't really understand the utility of that. Like I just don't. Of the reenactment of the crime.
And maybe they think that if they have somebody reenacting it, they'll be able to catch them retroactively in the act. Like I don't know.
Well, I think what they're trying to do is solidify by basically being like, okay, like if they can reenact it and it fits with our forensic reconstruction of the scene, then they probably did do it because they have like inside knowledge. But in this case, like a little girl falling off a dock or being pushed off doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure out how that would work.
Yeah.
Right.
Especially like a 2-year-old.
Yeah. So he admitted to it. They recorded it. In 2007, he was convicted of the murders. He appealed it in 2012, and the Court of Appeal overturned it 2-1 and ordered a new trial. The court position was that Hart believed he had no choice but to confess, because the operatives had not given him a way out of the situation.
Yeah. So
therefore, his confession under duress, even though he wasn't detained. So in this case, because the fact that he thought he was working for a big gang, it was obvious that they wanted to hear about this crime, and like him leaving the gang, like you don't get to leave gangs, right? Him leaving the gang or saying no to them, like a reasonable person would feel in danger in that situation.
Yeah.
So that was the justification for the court saying that he was under duress.
Well, I can also see how it could lead the court to believe that he was being taken advantage of as well.
Yeah, that was another thing that they noted. That because of them befriending him and him being socially isolated.
Yeah.
It also was playing on the emotional aspect of like his only friends, right?
Well, yeah, because that's what I'm just thinking of is like if he went from being socially isolated, not having a way to earn money, like having a medical condition that makes it difficult for him to find work, and then suddenly these people are providing him with companionship and money and a way for him to provide for himself and his wife, like of course he's going to feel like he needs to do something to prove himself. Like I'm not trying to defend him, but I am saying that like if he didn't do it, I could see the mentality that would lead to a false confession.
Yeah, well the thing about these is that the guilt or innocence is irrelevant. It's about your rights at this point. Like right. you have a right not to be forced into a confession. And so like the traditional way we think about it is like if the police lock you in a room and like beat you up to get a confession, obviously that's like not a legit confession.
I mean, this is just manipulative.
Yeah.
It's a different form.
And so like this, even though he didn't know the police were involved and hadn't been like so the police thinking was that like he could have just walked away from this, and like he legit could have, but the court ruling is that he didn't know that.
Yeah.
And that's the important part. Is if a reasonable person in his position wouldn't have believed that they could leave the situation, then it's under duress, right?
Right. I mean, like if I was in that situation, which like I wouldn't be, but if I was, I would not feel safe if I met the big boss.
Yeah.
And they were like we want to make you a full member, but you gotta show us how you killed somebody. Like, I'd be so scared.
Yeah. The takeaway from this is that if you're going to use this kind of tactic, you have to set it up in such a way that a reasonable person would feel they could leave the situation.
Yeah.
So the Crown appealed, because they always do.
Mm-hmm.
The Supreme Court upheld the ruling in July 2014 unanimously.
Oh, shit.
They ruled the confession was inadmissible. The court also held that due to the implied threat of violence and intimidation, it constitutes an abuse of power of process by police, and urged future court judges to view such cases with greater scrutiny.
Mm.
They also did mention like the relationships; those were a little bit less important to this ruling, because like in this case, it was reasonable to think that like he was in danger if he didn't play along.
Yeah.
But the court did note that the money and like the freedom and the having friends were also important factors for someone so isolated.
It's nice to know that they at least took into consideration the like social aspect of it. Again, I'm not saying that like I believe one way or the other whether or not he had done it, and I know that like with the legal system, a person's rights change depending on kind of like the situation, but you very rarely hear about courts, I guess, having empathy for people that they view as criminals.
Yeah, and also another important thing about this is that there's a legal concept called the fruit of the poison tree,
Mm-hmm.
which is if something is deemed to be a rights violation,
mm-hmm.
every single piece of evidence you got because of that is now also admissible, even if it was obtained legitimately.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah. So like a typical example is like if I pull you over and I don't have grounds to pull you over,
mm-hmm.
and then I find like that you've got weed in the car and you're not supposed to, and I search it and find explosives and I find all this illegal stuff. Because I didn't have grounds to pull you over, all of that evidence is inadmissible.
Well, especially since weed is legal in Canada.
So well, you can't drive while high. And
no, you can't drive while high, but you can have weed.
Okay,
in the
well,
car.
if you had open liquor in it,
okay, yeah.
Because like say if I pull you over for impaired driving, I can search your car for liquor, and if I find if I find evidence of other crimes, that's admissible because my search was legal, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if I pulled you over for no reason because I didn't like you, and I didn't have a legit reason to pull you over, and then you had open liquor, and then I used it to search the car, inadmissible because the initial rights violation renders all that evidence inadmissible.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a safeguard in the legal system to keep cops from doing one shitty thing and be like, well, we'll lose that piece of evidence, but we have all those other people. No, everything you get from that rights violation is inadmissible.
Which makes sense.
And because our court case, like I don't know how strong their court case was without the confession.
Yeah.
But because everything else they had was based on confession, all inadmissible. Mm-hmm. So I don't think they ever tried this again. Which, yeah, fair enough.
I mean, again, I don't know whether he did it or not. Like I know it sounds like I'm really trying to defend this guy, but we don't know. We don't have conclusive evidence one way or the other.
Yeah, and like it doesn't really matter whether he did it or not. The point is his rights are violated, and that's one thing that like is people have a hard time wrapping their head around with the legal system, is that how you interact with the courts and the government is about your rights. Like they're trying to protect society by convicting you of crimes if like you've done it, but they have to do it in such a way your rights aren't being violated. Mm-hmm. And in this case, his rights were violated, so inadmissible.
Right.
Our next case is United States versus Burns, 2001.
Okay.
So even though this is United States versus Burns, this is a Canadian court case.
Okay.
And this is another one that's been made famous in like Netflix and all that crap. So in 2004, Atif Rafay and Sebastian Burns were convicted of the murder of Rafay's family in Washington in 1994.
Okay.
What makes this case interesting is that although it was a crime in the USA, the men were from West Vancouver and were in Canada at the time of the investigation. So the RCMP was basically helping out the police of the jurisdiction where the crime happened by instead of having to find a way to investigate a crime in a foreign country where they have no ability, the RCMP investigated it for them.
Okay.
So the confession was obtained by the RCMP using Mr. Big's thing, right? It's notable because this case, United States versus Burns, is a Canadian court case because this case actually revolves around the extradition.
Okay.
So the murder case was heard in the States, right?
Okay.
But this case is about their extradition. The case revolves around whether the Canada would extradite them because the death penalty was a possibility.
Oh, right. And for people who don't know, Canada doesn't have the death penalty.
Yeah.
The most that we can give somebody is life, which I believe here is 25 years.
Yeah, there's some rules around that. Someone can actually be in prison for life, but it's kind of rare.
It's very rare.
Yeah. So Canada in general won't extradite if the death penalty is a possibility. There are situations where like they like crimes against humanity is one thing that like Canada would extradite even if the death penalty was on the table.
Right.
But in general, they won't. So prosecutors in the States promised not to pursue a death penalty, and so the pair were extradited. Partially because this conviction hinged heavily on the Mr. Big confession, 3 different Innocence Projects have supported Burns and Raffay. So they did get convicted, which is a bit weird because the States usually doesn't use that kind of tactic.
Right.
But I guess for whatever reason, like the information was admissible, probably because the fact it wasn't obtained in the United States, it was obtained by Canadian enforcement. Also notable that they were minors, I believe, at the time of the investigation, so they're the youngest people in it, Mr. Big.
Right.
Which would also, like, I'd bring into question, like, how safe they felt in those situations, right?
Yeah.
So that has come up before.
Well, the same thing with the previous case, like taking into consideration their age and like their own social networks. It could be possible that these were the only adults that they had in their lives that they felt that they could rely on.
Yeah, potentially. But 3 different Innocence Projects. So like an Innocence Project, people don't know, is an organization, like a charitable organization, that provides legal aid to people that they believe are wrongly convicted.
I think a major documentary that people might know of when thinking of the Innocence Project is Making a Murderer.
Yeah. So in this case, 3 different Innocence Projects have supported them, which is notable because, usually it'll just be one, but I guess there's 3 different ones that have like all believe that this and a large part of it is a Mr. Big sting.
Right.
So I'm not going into a whole lot of details with this case because of the Innocence Project things. I don't want to add more fuel to the fire of like, are they innocent, are they not innocent?
Right, we don't know.
When I was researching this, I actually found posts on Reddit where like a lot of bots were like uploading posts saying that they were guilty. So like there's some weirdness around this case, and the media is like, as usual with these cases, is not handling it well.
Well, I mean, it's very politicized. You either view it one way or the other.
Yeah. And our last case we're going to talk about is one that is not a violation, and is, other than the fact that the murder involved, is a little bit funny how it went down.
Is it the one from Australia?
No, this one's also from Canada.
Oh, okay. I got so excited.
Yeah. So this is R.V. Kelly 2017.
Okay.
So
pretty recent.
Yeah, pretty recent. So in 2009, Michael Earl Kelly was convicted of the murder of his wife Judith Theobald. This case was before the Hart case. So this conviction happened before the Hart case, but because of the Hart ruling, it brought up enough grounds to appeal. So the thing with case law is that they build on each other. So because the Hart case was overturned, he was able to argue that, like, okay, my case is similar, so mine should be reheard.
Yeah,
right?
I absolutely. I mean, if you're somebody in jail, regardless of whether you did it or not, if you see somebody else used a specific legal way to get out of a case similar to yours, like, of course you're going to use it.
Yeah. So this was not a Mr. Big but the tactics were close enough to apply this ruling. So a similar sort of tactic was used, but it wasn't specifically a Mr. Big.
Okay.
So during the investigation, an RCMP sergeant posed as an insurance investigator and claimed that there was life insurance policies Kelly was entitled to. He initially paid him $3,000. I gave him a check for $3,000 and said, hey, I managed to get this. So there was an additional $571,000.
Oh my god.
Yeah, that was this. This is all bullshit.
I mean, yeah, but still, Jesus, that's a large. If it was real, that's a large life insurance policy.
Yeah, but he said the money wasn't able to be released because Kelly was still a suspect. Now, I've had life insurance. Mm-hmm. Life insurance usually does say that if there's foul play involved from any beneficiaries, they don't pay out,
Right.
which is obvious because like
It's to try to prevent murder.
it's to try to prevent murder, right? So he's basically saying like, hey, like you're not convicted yet, but you're a suspect, so they're not going to pay out while you're still a suspect. So we have to figure this out somehow. So the undercover proposed that they pin it on a terminally ill person he knew. He's like, yeah, I got a buddy who will help us out. He's gonna die, so he'll help us get this money. But that they would need information to give the scapegoat to convince the police that he was the real murderer.
So he thought that this person who represented an insurance company was going to help him commit insurance fraud?
Well, it's because the insurance guy was proposing this. Like, I think this is one of those things where it's like, hey, it's a lot of money, like, and I know you did it, but like, if we can pin it on someone else, like, give me a cut and you'll have your money, right?
Okay.
Yeah, so basically he's playing a dirty insurance guy.
Yeah.
So initially Kelly refused and said he hadn't done anything.
Yeah.
Eventually, though, he did change his mind, and he provided incriminating information. He provided like specific details of the crime scene that like he shouldn't know unless he had done it.
Right.
Right. So that's how he was convicted.
Right, which does make sense. Like, how would you know unless you were there?
Yeah. So he appealed it on the same grounds as the Hart case, saying that like he was under duress and blah blah blah. But the appeal court rejected the appeal, saying that Kelly was essentially participating in insurance fraud.
Yeah. And
was not under any threat of violence, was not under threat of any gang activity, and the police did not befriend him or attempt to exploit a vulnerability of his. Like
you could argue financial vulnerability, but that's tenuous at best.
Maybe the RCMP officer played this one right in this case because he, instead of being like, I'm your buddy or like whatever, he's like I'm a really shady guy, but I have access to stuff that can help you.
Right.
So like anyone who was like court based or anyone who was innocent would be disgusted by this and walk away.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
How is this different from what we were talking about earlier, where it was like the police officer's idea versus like the suspect's idea? Because
they weren't convicting him of the insurance fraud. So if they went after him for the insurance fraud, that would be entrapment because they created the situation.
Okay, but they were just kind of using the situation.
Yeah. Yeah. So the reason why he got convicted, because he got convicted of the murder.
Right.
The reason why he got convicted is because in the process of establishing this insurance fraud, he provided information that incriminated him for the murder.
Okay.
And so that's what makes this not entrapment, because they never went after him for the insurance fraud. Because there was no insurance fraud even. Like there wasn't actually fraud.
Bullshit.
Yeah, it was all bullshit. But because the fact that he was able to provide information that he shouldn't have had, and again, the court held that he was coerced into it. Like he had no reason to think he was in danger. Like if his wife legit had just died, this insurance guy's like fucking with them. Like you think he would go to the police and be like, hey, this guy's trying to commit insurance fraud.
Yeah, like if someone that I loved had like died, and then some insurance guy was like, listen, I know you killed them, but like if you pin it on this, I'd be so pissed.
Yeah, and of course he had the information that they needed, which incriminated him. So the court upheld his conviction because, like, yeah, fuck you, you're guilty.
Definitive proof that you did actually do this.
So this is an example of a tactic being applied well.
Right.
But this wasn't a Mr. Big. Like I have problems with Mr. Big, as most people do, because of the fact that like part of it is making you think you're part of a criminal organization.
Yeah, and also like there's the whole power dynamic where like you, the suspect, are talking to somebody that you perceive to be like in a position of power above you that could provide you with like resources and like finances.
Yeah. So I don't think that there's any situation where you can apply Mr. Big in a way that is neutral and isn't at least a little bit coercive. But like, of course, this here wasn't the Mr. Big. It's effectively just a normal sting.
Yeah.
But where it was kind of like bait switch to crimes, because like obviously if you're doing this, most people would think that like the insurance fraud is a crime. But
bait you with insurance fraud, and then we're gonna switch out murder.
Yeah. So the Mr. Big tactic is still acceptable for use in Canada to this day. Courts are a little bit more skeptical of it, which is probably a good thing.
Well, I mean, you have to be careful with how it's applied, because like it's a tactic that I think can very easily be used to get false confessions.
Yeah, and any confession that's done under duress, like even if it's legitimate, again, you're kind of screwing the rest of the investigation, because then anything you get from that
Yeah.
is going to be tainted.
Yeah, like if you get someone to confess and they're like under duress, but then you find like the murder weapon, like in their house or whatever, like
Yeah.
that would be inadmissible, and you don't want that.
Yeah. So I'm not a big fan of the tactic. Like I said, Australia used it. I don't have the court case in front of me, but I recall the first time it being used, the judge was very critical of it, saying that like we imported the stupid tactic from Canada. But again, it didn't violate any of the rules of the court, so they kind of had to allow it to continue.
I will say, I don't remember where we watched this, but I remember watching maybe a Forensic Files episode or documentary on the case in Australia, and I feel so bad because I could not take it seriously because Australian people, their accent, it's so like ingrained in me to be like friendly.
Yeah.
That when I heard somebody like pretending to be like a mob boss, I just didn't believe it.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Australia. If anyone from Australia is listening, my bad.
Okay, and so that's the Mr. Big tactic. Don't confess to crimes.
Don't commit crimes, but
Yep.
especially don't. No. If you commit a crime, confess to it, because maybe you'll get a later sentence.
Yeah, if you commit a crime, confess to it. But like, if you didn't commit a crime and like all of a sudden now criminals are hanging around you, maybe don't.
Yeah, maybe call the police.
Yeah, maybe they are police, but just don't talk to them.
Yeah, listen, if you think that you're being suspected of a crime and then suddenly, like, low-level gang members are trying to talk you up, don't engage. Call the police. Be like, hey guys, I don't know if this is you or not, but like, stop.
Yeah, just run.
Yeah, just run. Okay, bye!
Okay, bye.